Hi, and welcome to this presentation on Chapter 3 in your textbook, Strategy and Information Systems. Let's start with a little background. This chapter is perhaps the most central in the entire book, and this presentation is therefore going to be a little longer than the others. Recall that in Module 1, we defined MIS as the management and use of information systems that help organizations achieve their strategies. In this module, we will turn to the issue of strategies. In particular, we will consider two questions, namely 1. How can organizations define their strategies? And 2. How can IS help organizations achieve their strategies? Before I list the objectives for this learning strategy, it's useful to give you a very high-level overview of how organizations can formulate a business strategy and then build or acquire an information system that helps them realize that strategy. Ideally, the process that an organization follows is a 5-step process. 1. Analyze the industry structure. And one model that has proven helpful in doing so is Porter's 5 forces model of competition. 2. Identify a competitive strategy which allows an organization to create a competitive position within the marketplace. 3. Identify value change for the organization, essentially a high-level analysis of the activities an organization should perform to realize its competitive strategy. 4. Use the value change to define business processes, networks of activities that transform inputs into outputs and thus help an organization realize its competitive strategy. And 5. Build or acquire information systems to support the business processes and help the organization cement its competitive advantage. Clearly, the above is an idealized situation, and things are often messier in real-world situations. But even in those messy cases, it's useful to keep the above steps in mind. Before we discuss each step in detail, we'll briefly review the objectives for this learning activity. The objectives are that at the end of this module you will be able to describe Porter's 5 forces model for analyzing the structure of an industry, discuss how Porter's 5 forces model can be used to identify a competitive strategy for an organization, describe the concept of a value chain and the concept of a business process, describe the ways in which information systems can provide competitive advantage to an organization. And with that, let's start looking at the 5 steps that we talked about before. The first step in information systems development is an assessment of the structure of the industry in which the organization is active. A good tool for doing so is Porter's 5 forces model. The 5 forces that Porter identifies are 1. The bargaining power of suppliers. Essentially, can you force your suppliers to give you significant discounts or not? The bargaining power of suppliers is relatively weak for large retailers such as Walmart because they buy large volumes, but is relatively strong for smaller retailers. 2. The threat of substitutes. Essentially, how easy is it for other organizations to either create the products or perform the services you are providing, or to find an alternative to satisfy the market demands that your organization is targeting? If I own a hot dog stand, the threat of substitutes is very high, as it is relatively easy to find another way to cater to my customers, for example through food trucks. But if I own an exclusive 5-star restaurant with a stellar reputation, the threat of substitutes is much lower. 3. Bargaining powers of customers. Essentially, how much leverage do you have over your customers when it comes to price? How easy is it for customers to negotiate a discount? For example, because they can threaten to take their business elsewhere if they do not get a good price. 4. Threat of new entrants. Essentially, how easy is it to replicate my business? Again, If I run a hot dog stand, the threat of new entrants is very high, as almost anybody can start a hot dog stand themselves. But if I run a social networking site, the threat of new entrants is much lower, as it is difficult to build the technology required, and even more importantly, build up the number of users that make the network worth using. And 5, the final force, is industry rivalry. Essentially, how many other companies are active in the same industry? There are many fast food restaurants, but very few mobile networks, and clearly that's a difference in the industry rivalry. After we assess the industry structure, we can identify our competitive strategy. There are roughly 4 generic strategies a business can follow based on 2 dimensions. The first dimension is cost versus differentiation. Do you want to be a low-cost provider of a generic product, or do you want to differentiate your product or service? And the second dimension is focused versus industry-wide targeting. Do you want to focus on a specific niche in an industry, or do you want to compete across the entire industry? To illustrate, compare Walmart and Publix. Whereas Walmart is active across the entire retailing industry, you can buy pretty much anything in Walmart. Publix is focused on a segment within that industry, namely groceries. Moreover, in the industry segment in which they compete, Walmart tends to be focused on price, whereas Publix focuses more on the quality of its products and the range of products. Compare, for example, to produce or cheese offerings between Walmart and Publix. The textbook gives other examples. Having identified a competitive strategy, we can now focus on the value chain. A value chain is simply defined as a network of value-creating activities. In general, there are 2 types of activity in a value chain, namely primary activities and support activities. Primary activities directly produce value, whereas support activities are necessary but do not directly add value to the product. For example, in a university, teaching activities produce value to students, or at least that's what I hope, but the HR department, while necessary to ensure faculty and staff are hired and get paid, do not directly produce anything of value to the student. In general, we can divide primary activities into 5 categories. 1. Inbound logistics, that is, getting the inputs to the production process. 2. Operations and manufacturing, i.e. transforming inputs into the final products. 3. Outbound logistics, i.e. getting the products to buyers. 4. Marketing and sales, i.e. inducing potential customers to buy the product and allowing them to do so. And 5. Service, that is, helping customers with the use of the product. Each activity has a cost associated with it. However, only the primary activities also have a value associated with them, and for each primary activity we can then calculate the margin by subtracting the cost from the value produced. We can also calculate the margin for the entire value chain by subtracting the cost of all activities, including the support activities, from the value produced by the primary activities. The book gives some examples, but you may want to try to apply the concept of a value chain to different businesses, including a manufacturing business, a farm, and a university. Once we have developed the value chain, we can start designing business processes. A business process is a network of activities that transforms inputs into outputs. Organizations have lots of business processes. The slide shows the example of a business process for an online store for satisfying customer orders. As you see, it starts with the customer placing an order, the retailer receiving it, determining whether the customer has a good credit score and deciding which payment type to request, and then sending an invoice to the customer. The customer receives the invoice and pays it. The retailer then receives the payment and ships the items that were ordered. Designing business processes is extremely important, and most organizations have dedicated personnel, such as business analysts, whose sole responsibility is to understand the processes of the organization and seek opportunities to streamline them. MIS majors are ideal candidates for these positions, because the core courses of the business help students understand how to make sense of existing and then design or redesign new business processes. There are courses later in the degree program that cover business processes and business process design in great detail. The final step is to see how an information system can help an organization create a competitive advantage. In building their information systems, organizations can roughly either focus on their products or on their processes. If an organization focuses on products, the goal is to create new products, enhancing existing products or differentiate them. For example, Facebook used information systems to create a new product, whereas the original UPS application that allowed customers to track packages, since replicated by all other shippers, differentiated their service. On the other hand, if an organization focuses on processes, information systems can be used to lock in customers and/or suppliers, raise barriers, establish alliances, or reduce costs, and so on. For example, a large retailer like Walmart can force its suppliers to use its information systems to sell its products to Walmart, thereby locking in suppliers and reducing its own cost. The book gives other examples. This concludes our brief discussion of Chapter 3. Please read the relevant chapters in the textbook, and if you have any questions, as always, please contact me.